We're joined this morning by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Rishi Sunak. Thank you so much for coming on and spending a bit of time with us this morning. Talked there, Louise mentioned about the tougher measures on terror to be announced later on. Can you give us any more detail about that? Because obviously we heard last November after the Fishmongers Hall attack about similar changes being made. What more do we know this morning?
You're absolutely right. In the wake of the awful attack last year, the Prime Minister said we would unveil new measures to tackle counter-terrorism. A couple of weeks ago, the Home Secretary outlined a package of measures. Those include longer, tougher sentences, an end to the automatic early release that has been a real problem, more investment and an overhaul of our licensing regimes, supporting counter-terrorism probation officers at the moment that terrorist offenders are released, and also a huge investment in counter-terrorism in general, a 10% increase in the budget. Those were all going to form part of the counter-terrorism bill, which the Prime Minister committed would be brought forward within 100 days of us taking office.
So what
but
more
later
will we
today,
see?
he will outline some more. In regard to all of this, people should be under no illusion about our determination to keep everybody safe.
Can I read you a quote from the former head of the Parole Board, Nick Hardwick? This was last December after the Fishmongers Hall attack. I do know, he says, for a fact that the cuts and reorganisations of the prison and probation service have made them much less able to do their jobs and to keep us safe. I think responsibility, he is suggesting, in terms of cuts to policing and to prison services, that has a direct correlation to what we're seeing. How do you respond to that this morning?
I would say the counter-terrorism budget, which is what we're dealing with here, has actually been increased every year for the last 5 or 6 years. It's now up 30 or 40% on where it was several years ago. And we just announced a 10% increase, taking it to almost £1 billion for the forthcoming year. With regard to probation in particular, what the Home Secretary outlined and the Justice Secretary just a couple of weeks ago was a doubling in the number of counter-terrorism probation officers, an increase in probationary hostels where people can be properly monitored at the point of release. So this is all forming part of the plans that we're putting in place to keep people safe.
Can I ask you about lots of concerns this morning, lots of our viewers getting in contact with us as well, that this man managed to carry out this attack while he was under surveillance. I mean, he was being followed by armed police officers at the time.
Yes, obviously the Met Police have made a statement. It's difficult for me to comment beyond what they've said, given it is an ongoing investigation, but I can reassure people that the police are obviously doing absolutely everything they can to keep people safe. The measures that the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have outlined will be able to give them more powers and resources to do that as well.
There is, of course, many other things we'd like to discuss with you this morning. We're talking to Sadiq Khan at 8:10 about what happened in Streatham yesterday. But the Prime Minister will no doubt be talking about that later, but also referring to the ongoing negotiations with the EU and talking about there being no need for a free trade agreement to involve accepting EU rules. Is that realistic?
I think it's absolutely realistic. I mean, we wouldn't expect the EU to follow all of our rules as part of a free trade negotiation, and neither should they expect us to do the same. And indeed, that's not common practice. We've always said that we want to seek a Canada-style free trade agreement with the EU, and indeed that's something that they have offered consistently in the past. And what you see in those style of agreements, and indeed the Canada agreement in particular, is an agreement to work cooperatively together on the basis of being sovereign equals, but absolutely no automatic way that people would follow just in a knee-jerk fashion the rules of another country. That's just not something that happens in free trade negotiations, and it's not something that should happen here either.
You mentioned the Canada model, which is obviously one option, which would mean almost a complete tariff-free trading goods. I think they have about 98% tariff-free trade, don't they? But analysis from your own department, from the Treasury back in 2018, predicted our economy would be 4.9% worse off under that sort of deal within 15 years. Compared with sort of expected growth if there was still within the EU. I mean, do you stand by that analysis from your own department?
Well, I think what that analysis says, actually, on the first page, is analysis like that, it said, should be treated with inherent caution, because it is particularly difficult to model those kinds of scenarios. And it also said that in all cases, the UK economy is expected to grow, which I think you also acknowledged. And that's because of all the other things we're also doing. And the Prime Minister has been very clear. We want to drive growth up in the economy, and we've seen some positive results of various surveys for manufacturing and consumer confidence over the last couple of days and weeks as people are adjusting to the election result and the certainty of Brexit behind us now. But we're also focused on investing in infrastructure and uniting and levelling up across the country. Trade is one part of that, but there's lots of other things the government is also doing to ensure that prosperity is felt right across the UK.
There's one more thing I wanted to touch on this morning. As people look at the front page of the papers, they'll see the Prime Minister is expected to say that the UK will maintain what he says is higher standards, better is the quote, in many respects than those of the EU. Can you give us an example of where those higher standards, those better standards which we currently have, what's one example of where that might be the case?
Yeah, I could give you a few. I mean, let's take minimum wages. We have one of the highest minimum wages in the EU. The EU doesn't have a mandated minimum wage at all. Take maternity pay. We have a guaranteed 52 weeks of maternity leave. The EU minimum is, I think, around 14. I'll talk about holiday pay. There's another example. Again, in the UK, legal minimum 28 days. In the EU, 20 days. When it goes to the environment, if you look at what we're doing on banning the use of single-use plastics, that's not something the EU is doing at a legal level across the EU. So again, we're taking the lead, whether it's on protecting workers, protecting the environment. We have a record to be proud of. We don't need the EU to tell us how to do these things, and we will want to negotiate in a cooperative and friendly fashion with them, and I very much hope that that's something that we can do.
Thank you for your time this morning. That's Rishi Sunak, who is the Chief Secretary to the Treasury.